Hello everyone, and welcome to this monthly lecture of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. My name is Sarah Pearce, and I'm the chair of the Society. We're delighted and honoured to welcome Dr. Laurie Pearce, who is our speaker today, who is going to speak on Judean experience or experiences in Mesopotamia. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I will say a few words about the Society for those who don't know us. The Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society is a non-political cultural charity. We welcome all people or people of all faiths and none to our membership and participation in our events. The year 2021 marked 60 years since the founding of the Society by Dr. Richard Barnett, Professor Yigael Yadin, and their associates. Our focus is on sharing the exciting archaeological world of Israel and the Near East from prehistoric times to the Ottoman era. And our activities include a regular series of lectures, of which this is one, given by distinguished speakers exploring ancient sites, major themes, finds, cultures, and history. And the recorded version of these lectures is posted on our website for all to view afterwards. Our other activities include our work in providing a program of travel grants, which we provide to help students to join archaeological digs in Israel and the surrounding region. And we also fund our international academic journal, Strata, which publishes original archaeological studies together with the latest news and book reviews connected to the archaeology of Israel and the Near East. If you're not already a member, please do consider joining us. You will find a very warm welcome and many opportunities for engaging with the diverse world of the archaeology of Israel and the surrounding region. And to find out more about us, please do visit our website or follow us on Facebook. And so now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Laurie Pearce is a senior lecturer in Akkadian in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. Laurie is a specialist in Mesopotamian social and economic history of the late first millennium BCE. She earned her PhD in Assyriology at Yale University, and among many other activities, she was a Fulbright scholar at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Among her publications, she's the co-author with Cornelia Wunsch of Documents of Judean Exiles and West Semites in Babylonia in the collection of David Sofer, which was published in 2014. And this includes the earliest documentation we have of Judean exiles in Babylonia following Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the temple in 587-586 BCE. Laurie's publications on the Judean experiences in Babylonia have appeared in both scholarly and public-facing vehicles, so a very important voice in this field. She is actively engaged also in digital humanities research and scholarship, specifically as the corpus curator of Hellenistic Babylonia texts, images, and names, and you have the link to the website on the advertisement for this lecture. Laurie is currently helping to develop the building of an online site of cuneiform sources that document foreigners in Babylonia in the first millennium BCE. And her work in this area is crucial for identifying individuals, families, and their interactions in antiquity. And if you would like to catch up on a very recent publication, Laurie has recently published a chapter called Exilic Communities in Babylonia in a collection called Identities in Antiquity, which was published this year, 2025, in a series called Rewriting Antiquity. And I think that's very much what Laurie is engaged in, is the rewriting of antiquity. So very much looking forward to your lecture, Laurie. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Sarah, and I hope I rewrite it carefully and accurately, or at least extract the information that way. It's a great pleasure to join the extended AIAS community today and share with you evidence which expands our historical understanding of the Judean experiences in Mesopotamia from multiple perspectives. Much of history is written from the top down, meaning the written sources are produced by and reflect the perspectives of the higher echelons of society and power. Mesopotamian records such as royal annals, inscriptions, and chronicles belong to this category. History from the bottom up is more difficult to write from the sources, as first-hand records of marginalized members of society are less commonly produced and preserved. For the study of antiquity, less widespread and unevenly distributed literacy, combined with perishable and breakable writing supports, compounds the problem of recreating the experiences of all classes of society, especially for those nearer the bottom. Thus, while evidence exists to document the experiences of the Judeans, and indeed other groups of deportees in Mesopotamia, we must keep in mind that we are reconstructing that history through a lens focused from the highest perspective of the host culture downward. In this talk, I begin with a look at records that were written in genres designed to extol the imperial powers and their ideological aims, and then present evidence that brings us down the historiography ladder, closer to a bottom-up perspective, offering us a more proximate view of the Judean experiences in Mesopotamia. In the late second millennium, the kings of Assyria expanded their empire from the original imperial core around Ashur, with military forays in North Syria and the Levant. In the 14th to 13th centuries, the empire was a formidable military and political power. By the very end of the second millennium, Assyria's armies marched from the heartland, from Babylonia in the southeast to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. A period of decline in the 10th century was due to incursions of Aramean tribal groups in the west and years of bad harvest. But by the 9th century, Assyria revitalized and expanded its military power and geographic reach, placing the yoke of the god Ashur on foreign rulers, especially those in Syria and along the coast of the Mediterranean. The heavy annual tribute extracted revived the imperial economy and financed major building projects. Notable was the expansion under King Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 858 to 824 BCE in the large area surrounded by the dark outline on the map. Text at the top and bottom of the stele, known as the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, narrates his campaigns and describes scenes of the tribute brought to the king. The images in the 5 bands that surround all 4 sides of the stele depict enemy kings doing obeisance, and the captions below them describe the tribute offered. The yellow arrow points to these words: I received tribute from Yehu of the house of Omri, silver, gold, a gold bowl, a gold tureen, gold vessels, gold pails, tin, the staffs of the king's hand, and spears. The figure in that panel, in the yellow circle, remains the only known depiction of an Israelite or Judean king, namely the aforementioned Yehu. The stele's text and images express Assyrian policy, which allowed populations whose kings submitted to vassalage and paid heavy tribute to remain in their lands. Just over 100 years later, according to 2 Kings 17, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V laid a 3-year siege to Samaria that ended with the capture of Israel and its exile to Assyria. Curiously, the biblical text makes no mention of Sargon II, whose inscriptions, and not those of Shalmaneser V, record the conquest of the province Samaria, and the deportation of some 27,290 individuals to the imperial center. Such a notice, combined with the rather general biblical statement that Sargon deported Israel to Assyria, contribute to the enduring notion of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Spoiler alert, we will show at the end of the presentation that categories of administrative texts demonstrate that the tribes of Israel were not really lost. One just has to know how and where to look for them. The final Assyrian monument to be considered here are wall reliefs, now in the British Museum, but originally prominently installed in the throne room of Sennacherib's palace without rival at Nineveh, to proclaim to court visitors the power and ferocity of the king. Sennacherib came to the throne following Sargon's death, and faced pressures from a coalition of kingdoms in the west led by the Judean king Hezekiah. The Judahite perspective on the relevant events are presented in several biblical passages, most prominently 2 Kings 18 and 19, which records the tribute imposed on Hezekiah. 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold, all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, and in the treasures of the king's house. The Assyrian royal inscriptions record that as a result of Hezekiah's failure to submit to Sennacherib's yoke, battering rams were installed, foot soldiers assaulted Lachish, and 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, were ultimately removed along with horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, sheep, and goats without number, all of which Sennacherib counted as booty. The wall reliefs depict details of the materiel and military actions of the siege of Lachish and the deportation of its residents, but notably do not depict the treatment of the defeated Hezekiah, whom Sennacherib claims in the hexagonal prism depicted here to have confined inside the city Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. The destination and fate of the deportees is never articulated, but other sources will give us some clues. The Babylonian exile, a catch-all phrase for Judean experiences in Babylonia, begins with Nebuchadnezzar's assault on Jerusalem in 597, his destruction of Jerusalem in 587-86, and the deportation to Babylon of the 18-year-old king Jehoiachin, his family, his court, and all the people of the land, and serves as a touchstone for the historiographic, prophetic, and theological programs of the Bible. In spite of the centrality of this event in the biblical tradition, the Babylonian chronographic record gives it little attention. Indeed, this record, Babylonian Chronicle number 5, provides the only notice of the military campaign that changed Judah's fate. Its brevity is consistent with the terse style characteristic of Babylonian chronicles, which focus on reporting facts of the king's building projects and military exploits directed against the many small kingdoms and states that served as geographic and political buffers, in part between Babylonia and Egypt. But what happened to the defeated rulers and peoples, Judean or otherwise? Royalty and members of royal households were destined for the capital city, Babylon, where a small group of texts records quantities of grain and oil rations received. Excavated in a stairwell of Nebuchadnezzar's south palace, these administrative notices preserve not only quantities of these staples, but also the names and professions of various deportees brought to Babylon, notably the Judean king Jehoiachin, and the mention of 5 sons. The relatively large size of his portion in the ration lists correlates with the suggestions in the narratives in 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 52 that while Jehoiachin was imprisoned, evil Merodach, the Babylonian king, whose name in Babylonian was Amel Marduk, favored him. And in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the first year of his reign, evil Merodach did lift up Jehoiachin out of prison. He spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. And he changed his prison garments and did eat bread before him continually all the days of his life. This passage captures the Bible's exceptionalist framing of the Judean experience in exile and may reflect a biblical author's exposure to conditions in Babylon, but does not faithfully represent what we know about the detention of foreign kings. Texts from the South Palace recording barley and date expenditures and income include deliveries to prison officers and references to prisons of forced labor, but none of the ration lists that deal with Jehoiachin and other notables specifically mention those prisons or imprisonment. They may, however, suggest that the biblical author, or individuals who provided information to the same, was sufficiently aware of conditions in the capital to construct this narrative and to tweak it in a manner that served its theological goals. This unassuming text offers a look at aspects of the administration of imperial policy and a unique identification in the cuneiform sources of Babylonian officials reported in the biblical text to have participated in the assault on Judah and Jerusalem. Written in Nebuchadnezzar's 10th year, 594, between the initial assault on Jerusalem and its devastating siege, It records that Nabu-Sharusu'ukin sent to the Esangil temple in Babylon 1.5 minas of gold, that's about 950 grams, entrusting its delivery to a certain Arad Banitu. Originating in Sippar, a city north of Babylon, the text places Nabu-Sharusu'ukin in an area where high administrative officials held estates. While his specific contribution to military actions prior to 587 aren't known, this substantial shipment of gold was surely part of the booty he would have had to turn over to the central administration and king. But why this interest in this Nabu-Sharusu'ukin, whose name does not seem to appear in the passages in Jeremiah, where some of the names and titles are repeated? The two lists are nearly identical, but the differences provide a connection between Jeremiah 39 and that Sippar administrative text. In Jeremiah 39:13 on the right, Nabu-Zaradan's name is a Hebraized form of Nabu-Zer-Idin, an important official involved in the events of the Jerusalem assault and known from the Hofkalender, a cuneiform prison listing officials and administrative personnel in Nebuchadnezzar's court. In Jeremiah 39:3 on the left, the name Nergal-Sar-Ezer appears twice. This perhaps reflects a conflation of Nergal-Sar-Ezer and Nebu-Zaradan. It's much harder for me to read the names in their English forms than they are in the Akkadian. Notable is the fact that the name Nergal-Sar-Ezer is the Hebrew representation of the Babylonian name Nergal-Shar-Utsur, Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, known in English as Neriglisar. In Jeremiah 39, the second position in the list is seemingly occupied by the name Samgar-Nebo. This name makes no sense in either Babylonian or Hebrew and must be considered a scribal error of some sort. Samgar is undoubtedly the Hebrew rendering of the Babylonian title Simmagir, a high royal official, which also appears in the Hofkalender. Having associated the title now with Nergal-Sar-Ezer, a known holder of it, we're left with Nebo disassociated from any of the names and titles. Nebo is the Hebrew rendering of the Babylonian divine name Nabu. Assuming every named individual in this list has a title, we can now link Nebo to Sarsechim, identified as the Rabsaris official, producing the name Nebu-Sarsechim and given in representation in the red with the Latin letters and the Hebrew letters on the right. Thus realigned, the letters of the name Nebu-Sarsechim map to the consonants of the name Nabu-Sharusu'ukin, the official present in the Sippar text. Once the names and titles in the Jeremiah passages are disentangled, they demonstrate that Nebuchadnezzar's highest officials, already in office by the king's 7th year, were military commanders responsible for overseeing the conquest of Western kingdoms. To this point, I have focused on cuneiform sources from the Assyrian and Babylonian empires that reflect the high levels of administration in text and image up to and including the start of the Babylonian exile. But Judeans continued to interact with Babylon and its Persian successors, both in Mesopotamia and Iran, extending the experience down to the late 5th century, at least as far as recorded in the Bible. For the remaining time, I would like to focus on sources written by Babylonian scribes in service of various echelons of imperial administration that bring us closer to recovering experiences of groups and individual Judeans in Mesopotamia. From 1888 to 1900, the University of Pennsylvania conducted excavations at the southern Mesopotamia city of Nippur. In 1893, in a room packed with collapse and fill, archaeologists found more than 700 tablets and fragments. In 1894, Penn professor Hermann Hilprecht examined the texts in Istanbul, where they had been sent in compliance with requirements of excavation permits issued to lands under Ottoman rule. In 1898, Hilprecht published his identification of the texts as the late Babylonian archive of a business house run by the Murashu family of Nippur. Written in the years 454 to 415, during the reigns of Artaxerxes I and Darius II, They record the family's leases and subleases of land owned by the crown and assigned to the family, which provided to the crown military service and or taxes in exchange for use of the land. Individuals and families like the Murashu leveraged the leases and could amass potentially wealth and social standing. Written in cuneiform, in the Babylonian language, some of the documents also preserve alphabetic epigraphs with Aramaic letters incised into or inked onto the clay tablet. The Murashu texts were the first texts in which were detected indications of Judeans on the ground in Babylonia, identified on the basis of their diagnostic personal names. To explain this, let me introduce you to Babylonian name construction and naming practices. Babylonian names are constructed as short sentences, with a divine element serving as the subject of the sentence, followed by an object and a verb. For example, Nebuchadnezzar's name in Babylonian, Nabu Kuduri Utsur, means Nabu, the god, protect the offspring. In first millennium Babylonian legal and administrative texts, individuals are identified by name and patronymic, as in the two names given here, in which the divine element is the Babylonian deity Enlil. At the bottom of the slide, we see names drawn from the Murashu texts that bear the divine element Yama and Yahu, two writings for Yahweh, the deity specifically associated with the Judean cult. Such names are termed Yahwistic, as are Hebrew names that may be more familiar to you, such as Zechariah and Yehonatan, meaning God remembered and God gave, respectively. While reliance on the linguistic background of personal names is not a foolproof indicator of a person's origin, the distinctive worship of Yahweh among Judeans and Israelites is generally recognized as a secure marker of their origins. This table presents, in Hebrew letters and transcription of the Babylonian cuneiform, some of the Yahwistic names preserved in the Murashu text that also appear in the book of Ezra, in the list of names of individuals who returned to Judah from Babylonia in the 5th century. As all but a handful of these Yahwistic names in the Murashu text identify witnesses to, not principals in the recorded transaction, the value of these names is first in their contribution to identifying Judeans in extra-biblical sources, and second, to reconstructing networks of individuals with whom the Judeans interacted. Unfortunately, in this corpus, we lack significant details of their direct participation in the economic life of 5th century Babylonia. So you might wonder, what evidence is there for the location and activities of the original Judean deportees? The prophet Ezekiel gives us a clue in the opening of the book that bears his name. He reports that his prophetic call came as he was among the captives by the river Kebar in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. From a variety of sources, the path of the Kebar Canal is traced from around Babylon, southeastward past Nippur, and on to connect with other canals and land routes that linked Babylon to Susa. The cuneiform text shown in line drawing records that Zababa Sharutsur, a well-attested mid-level administrative official, has access to wheat and barley payments owed by a sailor and a harbor master. The payments were rent on lands held by the king and distributed to officials in exchange for military service, as in the Murashu texts. No Judeans are mentioned in this particular text dating to 481, but it attests to economic activity occurring at the town of Kebar on the canal of the same name, and provides evidence for the reconstruction of the social and economic world in which Judean deportees were settled upon their arrival in Babylonia. Whether Ezekiel was himself relocated there, or his presence along the Kebar was due to a short journey to join his landsmen, this information provides a context for his interaction with members of the Babylonian community, where he or later redactors would have encountered aspects of Babylonian culture that found expression in his book, the book of the Bible with the greatest number of Babylonian loanwords and technical terminology. The Judeans whose activities proved to be most visible to us reflect the words of the prophet Jeremiah, himself resident in Babylonia, who, recognizing the long-term impact of the exile, adjured his fellow deportees to build houses, dwell in them, plant gardens, take wives, have sons and daughters, and basically settle down. The images here reflect the housing and land layout of the countryside in which many Judean deportees were settled. A group of nearly 100 texts attest to the presence of a substantial group of Judeans in a place called Yahudu, that is, Judah, the Babylonian designation for Jerusalem. As the texts do not come from controlled excavations, we can only make an educated guess at its location, based on mentions in the corpus of other known locales and on interactions between people from Yahudu with others known from elsewhere. The likely location of this Judah town is in the triangle defined by the cities of Nippur, Karkara, and Kesh, most likely closest to Nippur, as was the case with so many other deportee communities. Yahudu is first attested in 572 BCE, 15 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. In this text, shown on the screen, the name of the town was written, the town of the Judeans, reflecting its population's geographic origin. Babylonian practice for relocating many defeated populations was to settle them in such mirror towns. Mirror towns in the Nippur vicinity are known as well for Levantine coastal cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Tyre. These were established to rehabilitate agricultural lands devastated in wars between Assyria and Babylonia at the end of the 7th century. To that end, the kings granted land to individuals in exchange for taxes paid in silver or in kind and military service. This military service obligation is reflected in the designation of the lands as Beit Kashti, bowlands, reflecting the weapons archers carried. The second earliest text from Yahudu confirms that a Judean was himself a recipient and holder of such bowland, showing that members of deportee populations were quickly integrated into the empire's socio-economic practices. In fact, the economics and social organization of these early bowlands are very early instantiations of the system that Morashu entrepreneurs exploited and expanded. The naming patterns mentioned enable us to identify subgroups of texts and in them families as well as activities of individual Judeans. We briefly consider a few examples. The first scenario is the family of Rapayama and his son Ahikam. Rapayama participates in transactions that on the basis of their dates suggest that his father Samakyama died at the very end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The dates also suggest the possibility that Samakyama was himself deported from Judah as a child or young adult. The dossier tells us about the family's fortunes in agricultural work. In each of Rapayama's appearances as a principal, he owes quantities of dates and barley. One text mentions 1,100 liters of dates and 900 liters of barley, as well as silver to various individuals, including officials in the royal administration. In one, Rapayama was to deliver an amount of barley to the estate of the Rab Mugi, a royal official, a position held by Nergal-Shar-Utsur encountered in Jeremiah 39:3, and who appeared along the Shareshi official Nabu-Sharasu-Ukin. The quantities mentioned and the stature of imperial officials with whom Rapayama interacted suggest that he managed more than just his own plot of land and may have served as a collecting agent for other fief holders in Yahudu. In spite of the quantity of activity of Rapayama and his sons in this land for service sector, the promissory notes and various debts suggest that he was not highly successful financially. Rapayama's son Ahikam appears to have taken charge of paying off his father's debts and assumed a business role himself, actively organizing at the local level collection and delivery of the estimated harvest yields destined for the imperial administration. Ahikam was one of the best attested individuals in this corpus, although we have just one text preserved for each year of his activity. His success is suggested in texts in which his 5 sons appear. Their names are seen at the bottom of the slide. The colors of the circle indicate texts in which the same brothers appear, and only in one text, marked by blue circles, do they all appear. That text is shown here with images of the two known duplicates of the transaction, a division of inheritance that includes inventory from their father's business dealings. A couple of features of this transaction are noteworthy. The division assigns two different, unequal portions to the designated groups of sons, suggesting they may have had different mothers, their inheritance shares allotted according to the mother's standing. Second, the text was written in Babylon, some 60 miles northwest of Nippur, and probably at even greater distance from Yehuda, where all of the family's business was transacted. This 3 to 4 day journey would not have been undertaken simply to carry out a single property division, effectively a family law transaction, one for which imperial officials would not have been needed for authorization. Rather, they likely carried out this transaction in Babylon when they traveled there to settle other business related to their father's activities. Not all of the Judean deportees and their descendants lived as tenant farmers in the rural regions beyond Nippur. Judean merchants based in Sippar appear to have enjoyed support from or connection to the financial resources of the crown and carried the title royal merchant. We have already mentioned this administrative text from Sippar, which records a shipment of gold from an imperial official to Babylon. This background of royal officers and shipments of gold helps contextualize the activities and social location of another Judean family, with evidence from a group of texts that record transactions but a little more than a generation following the 586 deportations. The family of Arich, whose name is not Yahwistic but perhaps West Semitic, is reconstructed from a group of 6 texts. One of Arich's sons bears the name Achiyama. Yahweh is a brother. This is the only unambiguously Yahwistic name in the family, and in spite of the singularity of this evidence, the specificity of Yahweh's association with the Judean cult assures this family's Judean origin. The conclusion is reinforced by the name Amushech, the Akkadian rendering of Hoshea, which is not Yahwistic, but does have strong associations with the Judean onomasticon. And I should note that Amushech's name here should not have a red circle around it because it is not Yahwistic, so apologies for the typo. 2 of Arich's sons bear the title Tamkar Shari, royal merchant. While it is difficult to determine whether activities of royal merchants differed significantly from those of plain merchants, quantities of precious metals that appear in the text suggest that they were either handling or moving capital from the crown. We are aware that precious metals were in good supply at Sippar. In addition to appearing in texts from Sippar, individuals bearing Yahwistic names and the title royal merchant appear among Babylonian witnesses to contracts effected in Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Given the peripatetic nature of mercantile activity, it is not surprising that Judean merchants made their way to Susa, and the status of some as royal merchants enabled them to participate as witnesses to transactions carried out and witnessed by other Babylonians. Also of interest for the process of Judean integration into the Babylonian social milieu is the marriage document of Kashaya, daughter of Amushe and Gudaditu. In the 5th year of Cyrus's reign, she married a Babylonian man. According to the book of Ezra, Cyrus promulgated his edict of return to Jerusalem in his 1st year. So this means that Kashaya's family was one that chose to remain in Babylonia. In addition to her 2 uncles, who were royal merchants, aspects of her marriage offer further evidence of the acculturation of this family into Babylonian society. The first point is the linguistic background of most of the names of her family. Apart from Kashaya's uncle, Achiyama, the only member of the family to bear a Yahwistic name, and her father Amushech, all other male members of the family bear Babylonian names, as does Kashaya herself. In fact, her name is the same as a daughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps given to her as an outward expression of her parents' affinity for the Babylonian royal household. Details of the marriage, evident in 2 marriage contract documents, provide further insights. Kashaya married a Babylonian named Guzanu, son of Kiribatu, descendant of Araru. The name Araru Miller is a clan or family name borne by members of the Babylonian elite, who held traditional privileges or prebends associated with the performance of cult service. In Babylonia, holders of these privileges married within similarly prominent families. Within this environment, hypergamy was evident. Brides from families of lower prebendary ranks married up into families of higher standing, reducing the supply of brides available for grooms at the lowest ranks. To remedy this situation, lower-ranking families might accept brides from wealthy non-prebendary families. Kashia's marriage is an example of this practice. Her husband's family may have accepted the daughter of a wealthy non-prebend holding merchant because her father had amassed sufficient social and financial capital to contribute to the Miller clan status. The exceptional nature of marriages between individuals from different social groups is evident in the associated documents, which in turn offer insights into Babylonian attitudes towards outsiders. Some features of Kashia's marriage document are straightforward. The dowry her brother and mother provide consist of items the bride would use in setting up her new household. Intriguing is the Akkadian bed, a term that might designate a furniture style and or serve to illustrate the family's acculturating tendencies. The most striking feature of this contract is the penalty for the bride's infidelity. She shall die by the iron dagger. It is one of a number of ways that social boundaries were reinforced in the language of marriage contracts. Those of the elite focus on dowry, whereas less than 20% of non-elite marriage documents do so. Language in marriage documents of the non-elite controlled the marriage partner's sexual behavior through institution of various punishments. Unfaithful wives were condemned to death by the iron dagger. This harsh threat, of which there is no record of it having been effected, appeared exclusively in marriage documents of brides lacking a traditional family or clan name. Regardless of the groom's standing, social connections, or material wealth, this marked and reinforced the bride's outsider status. Such signals of social location were of particular importance to the urban elite, for whom preservation of the purity of family lines was intrinsically tied to their prebendary temple service. Thus, while Judeans and other non-Babylonians had access to aspects of elite Babylonian social conventions, they remained marked as outsiders. Finally, the witness list to her marriage document offers insight into the family's economic and social circle. Among the witnesses, besides her father, her uncle, and brothers, other royal merchants are designated there, indicating the depth of the family's connection to this social position. The scenarios just presented all illustrate Judean experiences at Babylonia. Notably, the texts from Yahudu supply evidence for the experience of Judeans between the time of the Babylonian deportation and the recognition of individuals in the Marashu texts whose Yahwistic names mark their Judean origins. And we now return to the question posed at the beginning of today's talk, namely, what happened to the deportees from Samaria, the so-called lost tribes? And here I would like to give a nod to Jan Safford, a researcher who has just completed his PhD in Assyriology, with a dissertation that examines texts mentioning the Israelites and Judeans in urban centers of the Assyrian heartland and addresses this problem directly. Their Yahwistic names of the individuals facilitate their identification among foreign dignitaries who traveled to the Assyrian court as part of the imperial policies requiring tribute and diplomacy. Additionally, Assyrian deportations were designed to provide the empire with skilled craftsmen and specialized military personnel. Capture and integration of troops from defeated lands refilled the Assyrian armies. Notably, charioteers from the province Samarina, that is, Samaria, which encompassed the northern kingdom of Israel, were a valuable addition. Their existence is attested in administrative documents designated horse lists, which record various cavalry units. In Sargon's army, there is an entire unit identified by its place of origin in Samarina, Samaria. The assignment to a single unit of these charioteers with a common geographic background was surely designed to take advantage of a particularly skilled contingent, and an unintended consequence may have been the promotion or maintenance of a communal identity. How might this have come about? In the biblical narrative of 2 Kings 18, which records Hezekiah's encounter with Sennacherib, the Assyrian official speaks to the people of Jerusalem, and in an effort to convince them to surrender, says, "Make this wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you can produce riders to mount them." Such an offer may have been accompanied by alternatives of differing degrees of negative outcomes: fight and be annihilated, or surrender, join the Assyrian army, and be settled on choice land and derive benefits of Assyrian citizenship. I hope that my presentation today has illustrated the range and depth of information available for reconstructing experiences of Israelites and Judeans in Mesopotamia. Exile and deportation transform the lives of individuals and the destiny of a people. The biblical record elevates these events into the cornerstones of an evolving faith community, but hardly offers the closer perspective of the experiences of the individuals impacted by them. In the cuneiform evidence, we can, however, see mechanisms that facilitated integration into the host society, as well as preserve group and individual identity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for an absolutely wonderful lecture. I'd like to invite questions. Now we have a few already in the, oh, there's lots of applause in the on. It's very clever. Beautiful. Never seen it quite so good as that. But yeah. Well, you have a very straightforward question to start with. Is the dissertation that you just mentioned available to read on ProQuest or another
Not yet.
place?
Not yet.
Okay. Is it a Berkeley?
No, it is not. It is not.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So we have another question. The examples of everyday life mentioned show considerable privilege. Is this at all representative? And if so, how did it arise?
So this goes to the fundamental problem of history from the top down and bottom up. You're all familiar with the saying, history is written by the victors, and the very poor are basically not shown up, do not show up in the ancient records, except in occasional groups of texts that list slaves who are integrated into imperial administrations. But from the imperial perspective, all they really want to do with these lists of slaves, slave families, is keep track of who has to be fed, who has to be housed, and so on. They're not going to tell us that on such and such a day, the mother of these 3 small children, we do have records of mothers and small children in these slave lists, that the mother took off to go take care of her sick child. We don't get those kinds of records, and that's probably an extreme example. But in terms of the privilege, what we're seeing are people who have reason to be interacting with the administration. And all of these texts are written by Babylonian scribes working for the Babylonian administration. The scribes working out in the countryside were probably sent there, perhaps on rotation, sort of itinerant scribes who would go at various times of the year to do harvest estimates so that the administration would be able to levy the amount of produce that should be expected from an area, from a plot of land. And so we see these people interacting only insofar as the administration is interested in them. I don't know if that fully answers the question. I'd be happy to take another iteration of it if somebody would like to reframe it.
Thank you, Laurie. There's another question from Liz Freed. What percentage of the Judeans returned to Judah in your view, and what would have motivated their return to Judah, presume? Yeah.
This is a very sticky question because we don't really know how many left. We don't know how many were living in Babylonia, and the numbers of names that we have are just a few hundred individuals. Surely there were more than that living in Babylonia. I don't think we can really make a good estimate of the percentage that return. And what would have motivated them? The motivation would be to return to a homeland in time, in the short, say, 150 years or so. We know from the biblical record that the community was building up a faith identity. And the idea of returning to Jerusalem, to returning to the land, was part of that historical theological narrative. So that would be the real motivation. Of interest is a group of documents from a city. They were excavated in a city called Narab, southeast of Aleppo. And it's a very small group of about 25, 26 texts. And for a long time, people argued that the people in those documents wrote the texts in Syria. It's quite unlikely. At this point, there could have been some cuneiform scribes up there, but it is more evident if you look at the time span of the activities. The texts go from the reign of Nabonidus down to, if I remember correctly, Darius. That the texts were written in one of these mirror towns in southern Mesopotamia. That is to say that one of the kings deported people from Narab into southern Mesopotamia and established them in a town called the town of the Narabians, just as there was a town of Judah. And that for some reason, we can't really be sure what motivated them or why they were able to return. And when they went back to Narab, the descendants of the original deportees took this group of texts that were part of their family business history and took them back to Syria. This is the only other group of texts this is the only group of texts we have in which we can show that a population from Babylonia went back to their homeland in the cuneiform sources. So we're lacking that for the Judeans. We don't have Judean texts post-exile from Mesopotamia that go back to Jerusalem or Judah with the Judeans. So they were part of movements of deported peoples who could return to their homelands. Okay.
Thank you, Laurie. Yeah, we have a comment, but a very interesting one from Kenneth Miller. The Pashtun, the Taliban of Afghanistan, hold that they are descended from the lost tribes. They have names close to Hebrew names and have cultural issues that are similar. I had Shabbat dinner with a small group at the University of Arizona, and when one of them learned that I have Israeli citizenship, one of the students acted like I was his cousin. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
It's not a line of modern sociology or anthropology that I've really followed, so I think I'll leave it without comment.
Okay, thank you. But thank you, Kenneth, for that comment. Could I, out of total ignorance, could I ask a few questions, please? Laurie, do we have evidence of Judeans using cuneiform?
No. All of the texts in which Judean names appear are written by Babylonian scribes. Now, I say that with a caveat because we know that some of the names of Babylonian scribes are compounded with Babylonian theophoric elements, but a couple of them have West Semitic predicative elements. All right, so in the Nebuchadnezzar, Nabukaduri Utsur, the predicate element may be a West Semitic component. And the thinking is that such scribes, and there aren't too many of them, but such scribes were part of the Aramean Chaldean populations that were already speaking Aramaic, but were trained in the Babylonian cuneiform writing system in the schools. We do have indications, and this is debated, I still think it is Proto-Hebrew or early Hebrew. There is one epigraph on one of the Yehudu documents that is incised, not inked, with early Hebrew letters as opposed to Aramaic letter forms. Now, there are two explanations for that. One is that the Judean himself incised his name, although there's a little bit of a chronological problem there. There's also the possibility that if you're a Babylonian scribe and you can learn to write cuneiform, you probably can master the 20-something letters of the Hebrew or Aramaic alphabet, just enough to write a chap's name down. And there are people who do not believe that it's early Hebrew letters. There are people who are arguing that they're in fact Aramaic. There is, of course, cuneiform in, to quote the title of a friend and colleague's book, cuneiform in Canaan. But these are generally documents that are administrative, or if they belong to the literary scholarly corpus, and most of these are all very fragmentary, would have been written as part of training scribes in the writing system. And with fragmentary texts, we have no way of knowing who wrote them. Literary texts, scholarly texts, we are very rarely have indications of who wrote them. So basically the answer is probably not. Now, could the Judeans have learned cuneiform? And that's a big question. It particularly centers, or we could center the question particularly around the book of Ezekiel, which has, as I've mentioned, the largest number of Babylonian loanwords in any of the biblical books. And it's a very interesting situation because they come from different registers of the training of Babylonian scribes. Babylonian scribal curriculum had a fairly standard sequence. And in the very first stages are, of course, learning to make cuneiform wedges that look nice. You know, we've all done that with practicing our printing letters and so on and so forth. The next stages are learning to write words, and these are basically lists, word lists, objects of wood, objects of metal, practicing names. And I'll go back to that as sort of a sidebar. Babylonian names had a fairly standard set of orthographies for particular names. And then as scribes moved on, some scribal students only mastered, say, through the intermediate stage of the curriculum, which would have qualified them to do administrative work, recording transactions, working in the administration, keeping records of income, outgo, and the like. Those who aspired to, the PhD level of education would go on and learn the literary text, the scientific text, the stuff that we call the scholarly material. And the vocabulary in Ezekiel draws from all three of these, well, primarily the middle and upper levels. And it is difficult to know how he would have interacted with a scribe. What some people have argued, Ezekiel went to scribal school. Now, whether Ezekiel himself or later writers who contributed to the book went to scribal school, or whether they were just in sufficiently close contact with the teachers and students of these various levels, is a thorny problem to disentangle. It's not really hard to figure out how Ezekiel could have adopted or integrated the vocabulary of business into his work. Right? I mean, just day to day, even the casual traveler to a foreign country learns a couple of words of basic necessities and monetary units and so on and so forth. But that casual traveler doesn't pick up the great literary works even in a several-year stay. So it's a problem that we still haven't entirely solved. Going back to the names, What did I want to say about that? I lost my thread. All right, if I think of it, I'll go back to it.
Well, it was a wonderful answer anyway. Thank you, Laurie. Are you all right to take a few more questions there?
I'm fine. I think I ran a little long on my talk, so I don't want to keep
No, no,
anybody
not at all.
past their supper hours and so on. So,
No, it's perfect timing. Thank you. So Marianne's asking from fine, is it known whether Judeans moved on to other countries, for example, outside the Babylonian Empire? Where were they allowed to move on? And if so, where would they have gone?
the cuneiform sources don't inform us of that. We have to draw our conclusions from other literary sources, from other administrative sources in other regions of the world. I think the mention of Afghanistan. There are in fact records with suggesting that there are Hebrew or West Semitic names in those kinds of sources. Were they allowed to travel? Certainly within Mesopotamia, we've got the merchants traveling around that we can trace. I guess the question about being allowed to go back or being allowed to travel comes down to what you make of a document like the famed Cyrus cylinder, which is allegedly has been claimed to be, back in the days of the Shah, was proclaimed the first document of human rights. And claims to allow the Judeans to go back to Israel or to Jerusalem. And that's what's captured in the book of Ezra. When you read the cylinder, it is primarily a propaganda document boosting Cyrus's position on the throne, on the Persian throne. And when he talks about restoring temples and sanctuaries, if you look at the locations that he specifies, they are all cities either in the Median heartland or in central Babylonia. And what he is doing is saying he's restoring them to show his piety and affiliation with these traditional gods. He does say he allowed people to go back to the temples, but he never specifically says, and the Judeans can go back to Jerusalem. So that doesn't mean he didn't allow them to go, but it doesn't specifically say that he did. So a lot of these nuances of what happened, how do we know it, are teased out of the interstices of the text.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I think we have time for two more questions. Well, it depends how big they are really, but they're both on religion. So Howell Clifford says Isaiah 46 mocks Babylonian gods. Is this imaginable for life in Babylon itself? For example, in witnessing the Akitu festival.
The witnessing of the Akitu festival would have been limited to a fairly, of the most sacred portions of the Akitu festival, would have been limited to a fairly small portion of even the Babylonian population. What the Babylonians, I'm going to put them in scare quotes, the everyday Babylonians might have seen is procession of the divine statues from sanctuaries just outside the walled city or at the extremes of the walled city into the most central temple complexes. I don't think that we have a sense that the everyday individuals out in the farmlands would have had any access to the Akitu, to seeing any parts of it, even its more public components. in terms of mocking Babylonian gods, I can't think of any Babylonian sources that would do so. And therefore, I would have to say that the Isaiah passage is theological polemic. You know,
Thank you. And I think our last question, is there any evidence that Judeans in Babylonia would have practiced a non-sacrificial cult? And what impact would living without a temple have meant for eating meat in Babylonia?
this is a version of probably the first question I was ever asked when I talked about these texts. We have no evidence of what the Judeans were doing religiously from the cuneiform sources. There is none. These are all, frankly, each one is a very boring document, a promissory note. You have to deliver X number of liters of barley. You have to deliver X number of shekels of silver, that kind of thing. What can be teased out of them is the fact that we may have had a community that was willing to do business transactions on Shabbat. And this is teased out by looking at the differences. My colleague Yigal Bloch has written about this in great detail, looking at the dates of these administrative texts. And all of these texts are dated very precisely, day, month, and year of a particular king's reign. And with the help of all kinds of tools, we can translate those into not only numerical dates, but days of the week of the Julian calendar. If we look at the Yehudu texts, the Judeans, there are occasional indications where they were willing to do, where they did transactions on Shabbat. If we look at material, and now I'm not talking about the very early Yehudu material, but later on, if we look at the Elephantine material, records there suggest that they were not willing to do transactions on Shabbat. And therefore, we can say that maybe this was a community that was a little bit more fluid or flexible in its religious practice. But what they were doing religiously, cultically, prayerfully, we have no indication whatsoever. And of course, that's a great frustration.
Actually, there is one more question which is intriguing. Liz Freed says, I've argued that Cyrus commanded the Jews to return to Judah. Is there any evidence for it, or did I make that up?
Liz, you're the expert on things Persian administration. I don't think there's any explicit evidence that Cyrus in any of his decrees or any of the texts says Jews or Judeans go home. And I don't mean that in the worst of ways. I mean, just you're allowed to go home. There is no explicit reference to it, I don't think. But I'd be happy to stand corrected.
Laurie, you've given us an absolutely wonderful lecture, and you've been incredibly generous with no pleasure and so generous with answering our questions in such depth and with such riches. And I know I've almost everything you've said has provided something new for me to think about, and I'm sure it's true for the rest of our audience that this was a real rewriting of the history that many of us knew, and wonderful setting of the context to start with, and then a dive into these amazing archives of material, including this first evidence for Judeans on the ground, and for looking at Yahwistic names in the texts and the location and the activities of these different people, and even these very specific marriage documents with this rather terrifying penalty for a low-class Judean woman marrying out, I guess, is what she's doing. And also, I mean, it's going to be so exciting to see what happens with your digital humanities work and the mapping of these people. We really look forward to seeing that, and leaving us with that wonderful question of were the 10 tribes really lost, and your advice that we just need to know where to look for them, but we probably also need to learn cuneiform. So thank you, Laurie, for a
Thank you.
wonderful, wonderful lecture. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, even virtually.
It's great to see you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.